resembles the Tyrannosaurus rex of Earth's prehistoric age. Tyrannosaurus rex. King Dinosaur.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia. This month will officially begin our break between Season 1 and Season 2, but don't worry, I'm going to keep loading content. And in the meantime, since I feel like content for the break is obviously going to be a little bit shorter, a little bit more leisurely, a little less about research and really more about me kind of watching movies and sort of shooting from the hip and responding to them in kind. I'm thinking that in the meantime between these episodes, I'm also going to go ahead and start unlocking some of the premium episodes, especially those that were part of the Season 1 curriculum that me and my father put together at the end of this season. I'll leave a link to that in the show description, but for now, let's go ahead and jump into our episode on King Dinosaur, directed by Bert I. Gordon. In the summer of 1952, RKO Pictures re-released its classic adventure film King Kong for the fourth time. Just as before, the return of the original King of the Monsters to motion picture screens attracted substantial box office. Though produced almost 2 decades previous, spawned from the heart of Depression-era escapism, before the Second World War, before atom bombs and UFO hysteria, Marion C. Cooper's extravagant brainchild continued to prove itself timeless, both as a spectacle as well as a parable, both as a distinguished and practically unrivaled display of special effects wizardry, and with Kong as its tragic hero, a deeply resonating elegy to unalloyed nature trampled under the boot of gilded modernity.
Well, Denham, the airplane's got him. Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast. Beauty killed the beast.
In autumn of the same year that Cooper's magnum opus was outperforming many contemporary Hollywood prestige pictures, his latest and last project premiered at the Broadway Theater in New York City. This is Cinerama, too, would prove to be a smash hit. Part travelogue and part patriotic review, it was largely intended to unveil a widescreen film process developed by American inventor Fred Waller, a portmanteau of cinema and panorama. The system involved the use of 3 interlocked cameras fitted with 27mm lenses to expose 3 strips of 35mm film simultaneously, to then be projected by 3 projectors upon a 25-foot radius screen. While widescreen film formats and radial screens had been utilized and experimented with before the 50s, Cinerama offered prospective patrons, at a point of precipitously declining film attendance, an unprecedented degree of immersion that clearly foreshadowed future, less convoluted formats like IMAX. Though only playing in 14 converted theaters by 1954, it continued to do spectacular box office, and would signal the rise in widescreen film formats as the major and lasting innovation of post-war cinema, no longer a novelty, but the new norm. In addition to producing and directing the film, Cooper was also a board member and vice president of Cinerama Productions, though he found himself persistently frustrated by what he saw as the company's inability to effectively exploit the new process, and he would eventually leave because of that frustration. He was, as always, an irrepressible ideas man, and at one point, soon after the 1933 original's re-release, and even going so far as to court Willis O'Brien to return to do special effects for it, he had toyed with the idea of producing a Technicolor Cinerama remake of King Kong. It's tantalizing to imagine an alternate history in which such a project came to fruition. American science fiction cinema was itself, of course, on the cusp of a surge in films about giant monstrosities, many of them prehistoric, and a few directly inspired by the precedent of the immortal Kong. Around the same time as King Kong's re-release and Cooper's mere toying with the idea of a prestigious remake, a former publicity man for Warner Brothers and RKO Theaters named Al Zimbalist acquired the rights to an original script written by someone named Guy Reed Ritchie called King Dinosaur. According to Mark Thomas McGee, the author of Talks Cheap, Actions Expensive, the films of Robert L. Lippert, Zimbalist at first touted King Dinosaur as a project of ambition. It was to be shot in anamorphic widescreen process called Vistarama, and it was to feature special effects by Jack Rabin, recognizable for his work on a number of drive-in cheapies throughout the 50s, but also a number of rather distinguished films, such as Otto Preminger's The Moon is Blue, as well as Charles Laughton's The Night of the Hunter. Rabin would end up working with Zimbalist on 2 films, though not the eventual King Dinosaur. No, his touch can be seen on 2 of Zimbalist's previous films, or at least shot around the same time and very cheaply and very quickly, but released before King Dinosaur. Those films were The Notorious Robot Monster, as well as Cat Women of the Moon, for which Rabin also co-wrote the original story with Zimbalist and also acted as a producer. When King Dinosaur did go into production, it was apparently not with Reed's original script, but rather a new one cobbled together by a newcomer named Tom Grease, based on an apparently original story called Beast from Outer Space, co-written by Zimbalist and another fresh face to the world of ultra-cheap exploitation filmmaking, one Bert Ira Gordon. Gordon had previously worked successfully as a shooter of TV commercials in Minneapolis before transplanting to California in 1948. He continued to work in television for some time before linking up with Grease, serving as cinematographer and editor on Grease's debut, an independent action thriller called Serpent Island. King Dinosaur would in turn serve as Bert I. Gordon's debut, both as a director and as a maestro of unconvincing special effects. The project was ultimately not shot in anamorphic widescreen, but in a standard Academy ratio of 1:37:1. It was shot in roughly 6 days around the Big Bear Mountains and the soon-to-be iconic Bronson Canyon, for a shoestring $15,000, utilizing borrowed equipment, just 4 actors working on deferred salaries, and copious amounts of stock footage. The resultant film, running just over an hour, was bought and released ignominiously by Robert L. Lippert in the summer of 1955, just as the modern teen exploitation sci-fi flick and creature feature was gearing into full swing.
On the morning of March 18th at precisely 7:48 a.m., a coded message directed to our president was cabled from this observatory. a message of such vital importance that our Congress was called into an emergency session. A phenomenon out there in space was the subject of these top-secret communications. Earth now had a new neighbor. A new planet had moved into our solar system and had established its orbit around the sun so close to Earth that for the first time it was conceivable to believe that man on Earth could actually travel to another planet. A planet that had every indication.
King Dinosaur fits snugly somewhere between the space race movies and clearly Kong-inspired dinosaur flicks that budded in the early 1950s. In the case of both cycles, filmmakers attempted to cash in on the proliferation of interest in popular science in an age of emergent mass media and state-sponsored propaganda, as well as the state-of-the-art technical wizardry that they themselves could never hope to replicate. And even by those standards, King Dinosaur is an insultingly cheap and lazy affair, telling the story of 4 astronauts on an expedition to a habitable planet that they soon discover is populated by prehistoric monsters. It has neither the budget to make for a convincing space race movie or a dinosaur flick. After a solid 10 minutes of stock footage haphazardly dramatizing the preparation for interplanetary travel, complete with unremitting narration, the spacefaring rocket itself is actually just stock footage of a V2 launch that is then superimposed over shots of space and then rotated at a right angle in vain to create the illusion of it sailing over the mountains of an allegedly alien world. But because the movement of the camera doesn't match with the panning of the... because the movement of the camera that was following the V2 rocket up into the air doesn't match with the panning of the camera that is, panning across the horizon of the Big Bear Mountains. Because those things don't match, it's less like the V2 rocket is flying over the landscape and more like it's constantly jittering and bouncing, it's almost like it's skipping across the air like a stone. When the rocket needs to land, Gordon simply employs a stationary mat of the tree line as foreground and then recycles the footage of the V2 launch, but played in reverse. We never see the inside of the rocket, the closest we get to the actors even being in the same frame as their vessel is another stationary matte shot, with a cutout of the blatantly depthless rocket superimposed over a wide shot of the cast, who seem to clearly just be descending a hidden ladder. Animals were supplied and supervised for the film by Ralph Helfer, who is credited as an associate producer on this film and whose company, Nature's Haven Wild Animal Rental Co., also supplied and provided animals for Serpent Island. Who knows, maybe some of the serpents who appear in this film are returning players. The entire conceit of the planet, called Nova, is that its climate is very similar to that of the Earth and habitable, which the filmmakers have apparently taken as license to simply use run-of-the-mill snakes, gators, and birds to pass off as alien life forms. The most exotic we get is a kinkajou, a tropical relative of the raccoon who even receives a screen credit, Little Joe the honey bear. Inevitably, however, there comes a time for our King Dinosaur to finally make his appearance. Decades before modern CGI, Willis O'Brien's stop-motion animation techniques set the standard for realistic representations of prehistoric monsters. But after 1933's cash-in sequel, The Son of Kong, future filmmakers working under tighter schedules and tighter budgets neglected to repurpose O'Brien's expensive and time-consuming process. Rare was the Ray Harryhausen or even lesser-known Edward Nasser who carried on the stop-motion torch with Lost Continent, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and The Beast of Hollow Mountain. Even Eiji Tsuburaya and Ishiro Honda originally desired to utilize stop-motion to realize Godzilla. Oftentimes, though, the time and budgetary constraints, to say nothing of the constraints on imagination, were such that these artists produced animation that was so shoddy in itself that they may as well have not tried at all, really. At best, At very best, the substitute you settled for was a man in a suit, or a puppet, or marionette, which, even at their jankiest, could still look kind of neat. It was, with the 1940s 1 million BC, an Academy Award-nominated hit for special effects produced by Hal Roach and distributed by United Artists. It was with that film that the real shape of dino movies to come was settled. If you wanted prehistoric beasties in your picture, you disguised extant animals as their often spurious evolutionary antecedents. At a time when, King Kong notwithstanding, these sorts of adventure yarns were still considered, and largely were, brainless kiddie fodder, even major studios didn't often push the envelope much farther than even the lowest of indies on this front. Just look at Universal International's The Land Unknown, Fox's Journey to the Center of the Earth, and The Lost World. 1 million BC appears to have started the trend, and lo and behold, among the copious amounts of stock footage recycled for King Dinosaur is some of a charging mastodon from Hal Roach's then 15-year-old movie. Standards changed more slowly in those days, I guess. But at least Gordon and company went through the trouble of using a static matte shot to incorporate their own cast into the stock material, and not just wedging it in somewhere. All of the original dinosaur effects on display in King Dinosaur are created through the use of small reptiles and at least one mammal on a miniature set, filmed at a high-speed frame rate so that, when projected at 24 frames per second, this will ostensibly create the illusion of the creatures themselves having more weight and moving in a more plodding manner. I say ostensibly in scare quotes, of course. King Dinosaur himself is just an iguana. The climax of the film features him cornering two of our astronauts in a cave, and then going toe-to-toe with a small alligator and a tegu lizard for the spoils. King Dinosaur is one of those garbage-tier B-movies. Not even B-movie, a Z-movie, really, where historians and self-styled film critics who do touch upon it tend to conclude that there just isn't much to say about it other than how stupid it is. And yet, inevitably, write-ups about King Dinosaur do expend a lot of mental labor merely describing the various stupid elements of it, while almost shrugging their shoulders at the one aspect of it that, to my mind, makes it worthy of discussing at all, if only in the context of discussing the use of disguised animals, particularly disguised reptiles, in dinosaur movies. Perhaps it's just more comfortable to talk about Gordon's debut in terms of its stupidity, so that we don't have to dwell too long upon its apparent cruelty. The fact of the matter is that from the beginning of cinematic attempts to put living, breathing dinosaurs up on the screen, a path trailblazed unilaterally by Willis O'Brien, the interest in depicting these creatures has never been purely observational or scientific. As W.J.T. Mitchell outlines in The Last Dinosaur book, The Life and Times of a Cultural Icon, the dinosaur is not merely a kind of extinct animal, but rather throughout its history of representation, whether in film, illustration, advertisement, or even in the very creation and promotion of museum exhibits themselves, the dinosaur has always possessed a profoundly ideological significance. Dinosaurs become a part of American myth-making, a way of manifesting a particular idea of the world and of nature. From the jump, O'Brien's second short film, 1918's The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, it not only capitalized upon the prospect of seeing live dinosaurs, but also much more exploitatively capitalized upon the desire to see dinosaurs fight, a formula that the animator would only escalate with The Lost World in 1925 and King Kong in 1933. Far more important than the popular interest in dinosaurs as a scientific topic is the gladiatorial spectacle suggested by these ancient titans going toe-to-toe with one another. You know, these monsters who are veritably conceptualized as fleshy locomotives, their pugnacious instinct triggering at the flick of a switch. Their suggestive power is that they are simultaneously remote enough from our own experience to be veritably real-life dragons and fantasy creatures, but are conceptualized in a way that is close enough to our unconscious perceptions of modernity as a totally natural, organic, but nonetheless completely savage phenomenon. We see this rendered explicitly in King Kong, with the climax in Manhattan mirroring the events on Skull Island. The public sacrifice is exchanged for a Broadway show, the natives for quipping New Yorkers, Kong's Mountain for the Empire State Building, and the dinosaurs for a train car and biplanes. The big drawback of even O'Brien's stop motion is less a matter of technique than of motive. His dinosaurs are too overtly mechanistic, too industrial in their very conception. Shackled just as much by unimaginative screenwriting, these animals never hunt. They fight, and there is a very real difference between those two things, hunting and fighting. This sadistic spectacle manifests a myth of the essential savagery of nature, which in turn conforms by allegory to the naturalization of hierarchies as they have been manufactured and systemized in the industrial colonial world. Dinosaurs must fight because we enjoy cruelty to a certain extent. We understand unconsciously that it is actually cruelty rather than nature that sustains our so-called civilization, that sustains these systemic hierarchies that maintain order. But when you trade out the stop-motion animations and the men in suits for the thinly disguised extant reptile, the creatures are all too apparently real, organic beings with their own vacant, instinctual drives. They're not at all the hypercharging machines of Skull Island. Gordon acknowledged as much in an interview once. Quote, "You never know when an animal is going to move. I shot thousands of feet of film and the sons of bitches just wouldn't move. Nothing would make them move and nothing would make them get angry. So I finally ended up in the library and found a book with a chapter on iguanas that said they needed extreme heat to be active. So I bought a couple of heaters and blew hot air on them with fans." And so Gordon got the effect he wanted, as measly as it was. Although I'm going to hazard that whatever book he consulted did not say that iguanas need extreme heat to be active. Rather, it probably acknowledged that iguanas become more active in extreme heat. Like all animals, they are not just springing into action when a certain place gets too hot. They are trying to maintain homeostasis. When the iguana in the film opens its mouth and sticks out its plushy tongue, that's not a threat display. The animal is just too hot. It's trying to cool itself down. And the only reason I know that is because I took care of an iguana for 10 years plus. It was my first pet. When you see our King Dinosaur darting across the screen for Gordon's purposes, it is not just suddenly getting a jolt of primordial excitement from heat, like a battery being charged. It's trying to get away from the extreme heat. The dinosaurs in King Dinosaur and other films that similarly use disguised smaller reptiles as dinosaurs are all too apparently real animals. They are all too apparently not performing for our amusement. They are acting and reacting out of anxiety and fight or flight impulse. It's not just that these are not convincing effects, it's that the veil of spectacle itself has been completely removed. All that's left is the abject cruelty, especially when the dinosaurs do what dinosaurs are supposed to do in movies, to fight. Through a combination of the oppressive heat, forcing the animals into an inescapable quarter on a miniature set, and off-screen instigation, the iguana and the alligator, and then the iguana and the tegu, get into a fight. Except, of course, they aren't fighting. They're just attacking one another because they're pea-brained reptiles that don't know what's going on. Gordon is creating the illusion that they are fighting. And when he can't get the effect he wants from his performers naturally in scare quotes, charging at and biting one another, he's not above simply flipping them on their back himself or dropping them from off-screen. King Dinosaur isn't just a stupid movie, it's a cruel movie. It transcends the realm of the comically cynical and enters one of the more casually sadistic. It's probably not saying much to acknowledge that the treatment of animals in American commercial filmmaking is in itself just a symptom of a broader disposition with regards to animals and their relationship to humans, especially if we consider animals in terms of a hierarchy of when and where we actually empathize with them. Obviously, with domesticated mammals at the top, slowly going down the rung to reptiles and amphibians and, insects at the very bottom. While cultural standards of what is publicly acceptable to depict may have changed, while the patronizing treatment of and simpering affection for animals may be at an all-time high on social networking sites, there's a veritable cult of this sort of stuff that more openly, insincerely embraces a love of animals over people. The mass industrial consumption of animals at this time as food and the destruction of the environment are considerably worse than they were even at the height of the Industrial Revolution. What passes for our improving standards with regards to animals, even the increasing use of CGI stand-ins rather than so-called animal actors, is really just emblematic of the accelerating dysfunction in how we relate to animals and nature as fantasy constructions reflecting our profound alienation. Hence, we're caught in the perpetual motion of attempting to improve upon the animal as signifier in its treatment as a filmic subject, whereas the fact may be that commercial filmmaking is programmatically cruel to animals. I think I can say that Courtney E. White suggests about as much in a 2016 article in Cinema Journal, The Utmost Care, Kindness, and Consideration, the MPPDA versus Allegations of Animal Abuse 1923 to 1925, as well as her preceding graduate dissertation, What Looked Like Cruelty, Animal Welfare in Hollywood 1960 to 1950. These are both really great, exhaustive resources that I'm also going to link in the show notes. As White notes, while thousands of animals have performed in popular cinema, and while many of them have even become certified stars, there is very little scholarship of or popular literature, for that matter, that isn't of a activist nature, that addresses the use and presentation of animals in the film as a practical concept. For about as long as Hollywood has been in existence, there have been humane organizations complaining about the treatment of animals, and not just on the set, but in terms of the acquirement, training, and current and future care of those animals. Among its many responsibilities, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the antecedent of the modern MPAA, was there to provide the affiliated studios with a focal hub to receive and respond to complaints, as well as a propaganda arm with which to provide plausible deniability for the unique culpability of producers and filmmakers in the outcome of their utilization of animals. Obviously, very few people in the motion picture industry willfully desire to cause harm to animals, and they may even be, as far as they are concerned, earnestly devoted to the humane treatment of animal actors. But invariably, even putting an animal into the position where it needs to perform, so to speak, is unnatural and spectacular, and being in the business of mass entertainments, filmmakers will be intent on utilizing animals for the most spectacular of purposes, which invariably means greater risk to the animal. And therein lies the fundamental failure in only seeking humane treatment of animals, which places the burden of evaluation totally on how humans behave on an explicit level. Clearly, though, humanity isn't enough, and is even an essential component of the problem. Even as the MPPDA and its president William H. Hayes were fielding protests and boycotts about the utilization of animals for spectacle, particularly in westerns and historical epics, they were also very calculatedly attempting to defend the honor of the motion picture industry. and in so doing, the underlying precedent that the right of entertainers and artists to utilize animals is irrevocable was what ended up being reinforced, rather than a broadly oversought and prosecutable infrastructure for making sure that people were held uniquely responsible when animals weren't taken care of or ended up being the victims of on-set accidents, or not even accidents, but just practices that willfully put the animals in positions of controlled risk, which invariably leads to a certain amount of them being injured or killed, or injured and then needing to be put down. Undergirding all discourse about the humane treatment of animals in filmmaking and the voluntary self-regulation of the film industry broadly is the notion that the lives, health, and emotional security of the animals themselves are an acceptable risk for passive entertainment, or, much worse, artistic pretensions. I can't even really say that I have much justification for responding to the reptile torture in King Dinosaur as viscerally as I do, and thus have even less of a justification really for criticizing so bad it's good film culture in yet another way than I'm usually predisposed to doing. When the water buffalo is butchered in Apocalypse Now, I don't flinch. When the horse is speared and bled in Andrei Rublev, I feel sorrow, but not indignation at the filmmaker. There are invariably numerous examples of just as explicit animal cruelty in film that I'm not only resigned to, but I must admit that I find myself enjoying to a certain visceral or intellectual extent. And I can't even really stake my particular revulsion to the disguised dinosaurs of these kinds of films on my lacking some prejudice against reptiles because I owned one. I hated my iguana. It lived forever, it shit everywhere, and tried whipping me with its tail every chance it got. I wasn't really happy when it died, but I didn't mourn or anything. But there are always matters of degrees, right? Like, I just feel like even if it doesn't seem like it, there is just something so particularly callous, not just about utilizing animals as spectacles of violence, but specifically trying to make them fight one another. Again, it's all a matter of degrees. There's a certain degree to which cruelty to animals arises from apathy, i.e., well, it's acceptable that we risk crippling this horse with a tripwire and have to put it down because at least I got my shot. It's okay if these buffalo get shot because I paid for the right to kill them. There's also a degree to which it's ambivalence, a mixture of admiration for the animals as innocent and serving some greater purpose in the artistic fulfillment of the film, and then contempt for them as embodying basically everything that makes the world seem so stupid and cruel. Like their powerlessness makes it okay for us to dispatch them for like a ritual artistic purpose. You know, as in, well, it's okay if we bleed this horse because it's bound for the glue factory anyway, and the image of its death is productive in the creation of truly affecting art, that maybe its life on its own doesn't really make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. And I genuinely think that most cases of animal cruelty in cinema are a function of some combination of those two, apathy and ambivalence. But there is a third degree to which which is simply the naked, puerile reduction of the animal as pure fodder for our entertainment, and that's the camp into which King Dinosaur falls. It's here that Gordon stumbles across the line between animals as subjects for cinematic fascination and animals as objects and special effects even unto themselves. And this sort of amoral cynicism isn't just contained to the film's treatment of its animals. Just like the certified Hollywood productions that used similar techniques, they are inseparable from a narrative that takes a triumphalist stance on human beings making themselves the center of the natural and moral universe, as not merely surviving exploration into darkest nature, but also bending it to their own will, asserting their dominion, compartmentalizing nature within our own sphere of supremacy. When the astronauts escape the island where the dinosaurs live, for no reason whatsoever, they decide to nuke the place for good measure to kill off all the dinosaurs.
Well, we've done it.
Yeah. We sure have done it. Brought civilization to planet Nova. Come on. Let's go home.
So bad it's good film culture can only react to Gordon's film in terms of its apparent stupidity. But its cruelty is too real to merely be stupid. And the easy declaration of its stupidity further insulates the spectator from the potential that the film, despite its marginality in commercial film culture, actually distills the worst aspects of Western man's relationship with animals and nature. I guess I'll close out by returning to King Kong again. Kong is a movie that can be interpreted in any number of ways. But what's ironic is that the most obvious reading seems to elude modern film discourse, only because it's so patently obvious. If King Kong is anything, it is the story of the cruel exploitation of an animal for opportunistic spectacle. And the fact that such a story should lend itself so naturally to inspiring works that actually double down on the anthropocentric vision of the world, it inevitably contributes to a perverse fascination with animals as mere special effects, as vehicles for spectacular violence for our vicarious enjoyment. If anything, that should speak a lot to the programmatic cruelty of commercial filmmaking itself.